2017 has been a crazy good year for video games. It took me so long to even whittle the list of my favorite games this year down to 20 or 15 games, much less the required 10. But I've finally managed to do it. And as a result, I feel like my top 10 list this year has been the most personal that it has ever been. I was forced to cut games that I really liked, and a lot of other people really loved. Games that definitely would have remained on my top 10, maybe even have been pretty high up there in previous years, but this year, those games didn't even make the cut. And some of the games that did make my personal cut don't seem all that likely to have made the cut of many other people. And that's a good thing. It introduces a diversity to the Game of the Year lists around the internet that's not usually there, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what everyone else's lists look like. Admittedly, my deep fondness for the first game on my list comes down to pure, unadulterated nostalgia. As some of the first games I ever remember playing, old-school point-and-click adventure games have always held a special place in my heart, so it's not particularly shocking that I absolutely adored Thimbleweed Park. This game is the perfect love letter to the traditional adventure game, and that shouldn't be surprising given its heritage. Created by Ron Gilbert and Gary Winnick, the co-designers of Maniac Mansion, Thimbleweed Park shrugs off most trappings of modernity, while keeping a few that improve the experience. Most notably, a post-release patch added an in-game hint system that requires you to find phones and call a context-sensitive hit line, which manages to balance nostalgia for old-school hint lines with modern convenience in an extremely impressive way. Having to make the trip to the phone somehow makes it feel way less like cheating than a walkthrough or even a hint button, and it also makes you resort to it far less often. And the reason I focus on that small, seemingly tiny detail is that it is so emblematic of the entire game. Everything here is made in a way that maximizes your nostalgia while still managing to be modern in some minor way. Sometimes that's just because this game has been made in the exact same way a game would have been made at the time, but at other times it's clear that they had to make a decision between what people will remember these games being like and what they were actually like. And as far as I'm concerned, each of those decisions they made was made correctly. With From Software not making any new Souls-like in 2017, the door was left wide open for other development studios to take a crack at it, and there were a handful of games that tried to be this year's new Dark Souls, but only one game managed to seize the throne in any meaningful way: Nioh. And partially, I think that has to do with its pedigree. Nioh was made by Team Ninja, the studio most well known for producing the Ninja Gaiden series of games that honestly share a lot of aspects with Souls-likes. Obviously, there's the difficulty that Ninja Gaiden was infamous for at the time, but there's also some pretty clear similarities in the combat mechanics themselves, how deliberate your actions need to be, how precise they need to be. Nioh takes what this dev team has learned from years of Ninja Gaiden and applies that game's sensibilities in terms of setting and style to the Souls formula in a way that is extremely successful. More than any other Souls-like this year, Nioh tries to do new things with the formula. Granted, it's not always successful, but I'd rather developers playing with this emergent new genre try things and fail instead of making a relatively standard clone of an existing Souls game. Comedy is something that is incredibly and infamously hard to get right in games, and while games have gotten quite a bit better at conveying a lot of other types of emotion, comedy has largely remained left behind, with the exception of a handful of games like Jazzpunk that manage it wonderfully well. And West of Loathing is one of those exceptions. At its core, it tends to rely on absurdism, layering the conventions of westerns one on top of the other in a way that becomes increasingly ridiculous as the game progresses. But besides being hilarious, it's also an incredibly well-playing game to boot. The turn-based combat system has a really surprising amount of variety to it, and you'll constantly be upgrading your character's abilities and gear all the way through to the end. West of Loathing doesn't rest on its comedy or its gameplay. Its two most prominent elements are interwoven in such a way that neither of them feel stronger than the other, making West of Loathing one of the strongest comedic games made to date. In a lot of ways, Horizon Zero Dawn was overshadowed by Breath of the Wild, both at the time of its release and now in end-of-year discussions. But while Breath of the Wild represents something wildly experimental, something simultaneously old and new, something that changes what the open-world game is, what it's possible for it to be, Horizon represents the culmination of everything the modern open-world game has been. Put simply, this game is the perfection of what we would normally call the Ubisoft open-world formula, the template for what we consider to be an open-world game. Nothing about Horizon is particularly revolutionary, but it doesn't need to be, because it manages to nail every single thing that it tries to do, even if it is within a relatively established framework. That isn't to say that Horizon doesn't do anything interesting. Its combat system is a fun and engaging way to interact with the world in a genre that often pays the least attention to its combat mechanics. But Horizon doesn't neglect its open-world obligations in favor of its combat either. Its world is fascinating to explore and discover, and the story they've built is involved with the environment in a way that you don't see that often even in linear games. On paper, Horizon may look like an open-world game just wanting to check off all the requisite boxes, but it checks off those boxes with such high-quality elements and with such flourishes that it manages to rise far above its ilk. Cuphead is perhaps 2017's most visually intriguing game. From the moment it was first announced, people have been fascinated with its art style that emulates the animation of the 30s and 40s. But what people were unsure about up until the game actually came out was what it was going to play like, with some injected confusion about what the structure of the game was going to be like. At its core, Cuphead is really and truly a game where you fight a ton of bosses. There are a handful of platforming-centric levels and a few other smaller activities, but those certainly do not feel like they are the core of what makes Cuphead Cuphead. That core is unmistakably the game's boss encounters, which are as wonderfully varied and as inventive as they are frustratingly difficult. Cuphead is an unforgiving monster of a game that will give you absolutely no quarter, but that approach just makes your eventual victory over a boss that much more satisfying. Cuphead is a game that benefits from the resurgence of the 2D side-scroller just as much as it benefits from the resurgence of a more hardcore difficulty in games, and it takes advantage of both of those elements as well as its visual style wonderfully. In the lead up to its release, I regarded Prey as an oddity. This was a game that had decided to take the name of a shooter from over a decade ago that had aged quite poorly, and while it had nothing to do with that game or its originally planned sequel, their decision to take that name, scrap everything related to it, and reintroduce it as an immersive sim in the vein of Deus Ex or Dishonored just felt kinda weird. But odd branding decisions aside, the game that came out of that process is a wonderful example of the genre. Of course, being such a shining example of the genre isn't always a great thing, and Prey brings the positive and negative aspects of the immersive sim genre along with it. You have incredible choice and a deep story with regards to how you play the game and approach encounters, but the game has a tendency to bug out if you do anything particularly odd. Everything about it is extremely well written, and the situations are believable, but you'll sometimes accidentally sequence break something and manage to break part of the narrative on accident. Like so many immersive sims, Prey is a beautiful mess, but luckily for it, that's just the way I like them. I prefer having the freedom to do what I want inside any given situation, and if that happens to break the game a little, I'm happy to go ahead and reload a save to try again. Wolfenstein: The New Order was an incredibly surprising game when it first came out. Machine Games took the first popular first-person shooter ever released and managed to reboot it into one of the most modern and intriguing, while also managing to retain the fast-paced, old-school id Software feel. Wolfenstein 2 not only manages to achieve those things again, but it ratchets its narrative up another notch. The first game was impressive for a shooter of its time, but game narratives have moved forward in the intervening years, and Wolfenstein 2 does not shy away from moving forward with them. From its earliest opening moments, the game is not afraid to tackle some deeply taboo subject in the realm of games, with an incredible set of characters and excellent writing to back them up. But it tells their tale while still being a deeply satisfying and enjoyable first-person shooter that understands how good it can feel to just absolutely brutalize a narrative's antagonists. And that balance between storytelling and pure, unadulterated violence is one that the game manages to almost effortlessly maintain throughout. The last few entries in the mainline 3D Mario series have been a bit of a departure. After the fantastic Galaxy games, we've since been treated to 3D Land and 3D World, both of which were excellent games in their own right, but didn't quite manage to carry the torch for the traditional 3D Mario game in the vein of Mario 64. But this year's Mario game, Odyssey, not only manages to pick the torch back up, but arguably carries it even better than the Galaxy games did. And that's because Odyssey doesn't rely on any single gimmick to design its worlds. Each different world has an entirely different feel to it, in a way that no Mario game really has since 64. Odyssey's primary new mechanic, the hat-throwing and possession system, is far from a single-use gimmick. It fundamentally changes how everything in the game, from platforming to puzzle-solving, works, and it makes this specific Mario game enjoyably unique in a way that no other power-up edition in the past ever has. Beyond the intriguing and fun mechanics, though, Odyssey is the closest to pure joy I had this year. The environments, music, and art conspire with the well-designed mechanics to make the experience a constantly enjoyable one that left a smile on my face in a way that it seems like only Nintendo games can. Nier Automata is somehow simultaneously a by-the-numbers action game and a revelatory masterpiece. A masterclass on interweaving narrative with design. The moment-to-moment action in Automata is so pedestrian and honestly repellent at times, but everything around that action is so engaging and fascinating. And I'm not just talking about the story here, I'm talking about the way that story is presented, and quite frankly, the way it uses the usual boring and repetitive game mechanic of New Game Plus to progress its story is one of the most inventive things I've seen in game narratives all year. Honestly, trying to talk about what makes Nier Automata so goddamn good is difficult to do without spoiling some of the game's biggest surprises, some of its biggest achievements in storytelling. But suffice it to say that out of all the games with incredibly strong narratives this year, Nier made me think the most, made me consider what it had to say in a way no other game really did. And that's something that is honestly difficult for any medium to do, but something that video games hardly ever manage. But while Nier may have been the game that made me the most thoughtful this year, Zelda is still the game that I would consider the best. Even after a full year of games that have come after its release in the very early months of 2017. One of the biggest reasons that Breath of the Wild is so wildly successful at what it does is that it doesn't just do everything a modern open-world game would. When Nintendo finally decides to embrace more modern game mechanics or ideas, it never takes them as they are. They never try to directly replicate what other studios are doing. In fact, if we use one of the longest-running open-world franchises in the industry as a point of comparison, Breath of the Wild is a lot more comparable to something like Morrowind than it is to something like Skyrim. It never holds the player's hand. It has a certain level of trust in the player's ability to figure out what they want to do. A level of trust that the vast majority of modern open-world games simply do not have. In Breath of the Wild, the player is meant to look out into the world and find things to do on their own, to explore, much like they would have done in the original Zelda at the time of its release. There's no endless waypoints scattered around the map telling you exactly where to go. That's for you to find out, not for the game to tell you. Breath of the Wild contains all the activities you'd expect to find in a more traditional modern open world game. You're hunting animals, you're crafting things out of them, you're doing some cooking, but it never really explicitly tells you to do these things like a Far Cry would. There is a minor tutorial section at the beginning of the game, but after that, there's never any pop-ups or prompts reminding you to do anything or instructing you to do something specific. The closest Breath of the Wild ever gets is showing you where the main quest is. That's all the assistance this game is going to give you, and that's certainly laudable, especially in this day and age. This was a year for great games, but it was also a year for rebooting franchises, for taking them back to their roots. And that is something that Breath of the Wild does extremely well, while simultaneously bringing that series into the future.